Welcome back. My leadoff hitter, as always, my MVP, as usual, is Luke Jones, catching us up with all things that are Orioles and Baltimore Ravens. Luke, welcome in.
Dennis, how are you, my friend? It's great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you as well, Luke. And look, Oriole mania is running wild, right? The trade deadline came and went, right? The Orioles were close to making some big deals that didn't happen, so we get a pitcher that some people have said doesn't move the needle for them. But this team, I'm telling you, they're so much fun to watch. They're gritty. Uh, they can hit the ball, that's for sure, and they're very, very entertaining. And I am all in on these Baltimore Orioles.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that Nestor and I talked about this a lot. And look, I don't think Jack Flaherty, the acquisition of Jack Flaherty, is worth doing cartwheels over by any stretch of the imagination. I think he's an interesting addition to their starting rotation. I think he's going to help them. Is it does he dramatically improve their World Series chances? I'd be lying to you if I thought that that was the case, but I think it's a move that helps them on a variety of levels. But the thing that I keep coming back to is, whether you were disappointed, whether you wanted a, Michael Elias even said they took some bigger swings. Obviously, they didn't connect on any bigger acquisitions. And we know that teams are very aware of the Orioles farm system, very aware of the Orioles prospects, and they are trying to take advantage of that when the Orioles are looking to buy and add pieces. And the one thing you can say about Flaherty and Fujinami, the Japanese pitcher they acquired about a week and a half ago, is they did not command prospects that put a dent in the future of their
Sure.
farm system and the future of their ability to replenish talent and have that pipeline. So it's good to see that. But for all of that talk and all of the talk about concerns about the pitching, the bullpen beyond Felix Bautista, these young starters that are already approaching their career highs in innings. And look, those are valid concerns. And I don't think anyone should be ignoring some of those realities. But at the same time, you keep coming back to the fact that they have the best record in the American League. They're in first place in the AL East. And that's not to say that that is guaranteed to continue over the next 2 months. And that's why Mike Elias was trying to fortify this roster. And that's why people can have the valid criticism or express concern that would like to have seen the Orioles done more. I would have liked to have seen them add another reliever that you could use for the late innings. I think that's still very much a reasonable concern for this team. But you have to remind yourselves that they've earned some benefit of the doubt with how they've played over the course of 4 months. And when you're talking about a team that's 25 games over 500 and close to a pace of winning 100 games for a season, they deserve that benefit of the doubt. So it's not just the players and the coaches, but even Mike Elias, as he's now in uncharted territories for himself as a general manager. The rebuild's over. That's in the rearview mirror. They're in a position now. This was his first true chance to be a buyer at the trade deadline. And some people will debate they could have done that last year, and they ended up selling at the deadline last year.
Right.
But he's growing. He's new to this as well. So that's not to make an excuse. That's not to say that the Orioles won't need to be bold at some point in time, whether you're talking about a trade, whether you're talking about a bigger free agent signing, whether you're talking about signing a Gunnar Henderson to a contract extension, which is something that I would be looking to do much sooner rather than later, even at this early stage of his career. They're
Mhm.
going to have to do that. But in the meantime, don't lose sight of how good this team already is and how well this team has continued to play. And, that's why, regardless of what they didn't get at the deadline, regardless of what they may not have on their roster, they still have a heck of a lot going for themselves. And let's keep that in mind as you're trying to size them up against the rest of the competition here down the stretch.
Luke, again, my background is I have a significant football background, not so much with baseball. So I would lean on your expertise to answer this question for me, and maybe for some fans out there that don't quite know. At what point do they talk about an extension for Rutschman and Henderson? At what point do they have to extend them and give them a market value deal? How many years from now?
Well, I mean, you have 6 years of club control
Got it.
with any young player. So, technically speaking, they have a lot of time.
Okay.
However, as you know, Dennis, and this certainly applies for football or any sport, the closer a player gets to free agency, the less inclined he's going to be to sign an extension when they know that having 29 other teams involved, or in football, 31
Sure.
other teams involved, is going to increase their
Okay.
market. I mean, the reality is, and not to get too deep into the weeds here, in the case of looking specifically at Gunnar Henderson and Adley Rutschman, because
Right.
Jackson Holliday's not here yet. I mean, you could try to sign Jackson Holliday to an extension if you
Sure,
wanted
but
to, but he's not in the majors yet.
right, but Rutschman
But
and Henderson, they were what the first round draft pick and the second round draft pick in the same year.
yeah,
So do the Orioles retain the rights for 6 years from that moment on? Is
it,
that
it
when
has
is
it
that when the
has
clock
to do,
starts?
the clock starts. So in the case of Rutschman, he finished second in American League Rookie of the Year. So he was credited with a full year of service time. In
Got
the
it.
case of Gunnar, so he already has a year of service time under his belt. Gunnar Henderson, since he was only called up for the final month of last season, this is his rookie season. So basically
Okay.
they're staggered by a year.
Right. So that from the time they
So
make the major, so the time served in the minors doesn't count.
no, it
Okay.
does. It
Okay.
doesn't. It
Very
has to
good.
do
Well,
with
thank you.
service time. Yeah. But the point is with that is, the sooner you sign them to an extension, theoretically, you buy out a couple years of free agency. In the case of Adley Rutschman, if you were going to sign him to a contract extension right now, I mean, I don't know how long you'd want to make that. He's a catcher, right? And even if he's a terrific catcher, he's a
Understood.
catcher. So you're not going to give him a 10-year deal.
Right.
But Gunnar Henderson, being either a shortstop or a third baseman long term at age 22, I'd be inclined to give him a 10-year deal and not think too much about it. So, do I think it's going to happen right now, considering the uncertainty with ownership and so many of the off field things that you and I have talked about and will continue to talk about until
Sure.
the Orioles give
Sure.
you reason not to talk about it?
Ah,
I'm not
man.
holding my breath, but my prevailing point that I was trying to make is at some point the Orioles are going to need to be bold in some moves that they make. To this point, it's been very measured. It's been additions on the margins. Jack Flaherty's not an ace. I think he's going to help their rotation. I think he's going to help them, with some trickle down effects that can help their bullpen even, and certainly manage some of their young starters who have thrown a lot of innings that they're not accustomed to doing at this point in their young careers. But at the same time, at some point in time, you're going to have to connect on one of those bigger swings. They've kind of been a team that's relied so much just on drafting and developing of their young players, which, by the way, should be the lifeblood of how you do things if you're doing it well. The Ravens do the same thing in a different sport, but at the same time, they are going to get to a point where they're going to have to be a little more bold, whether it's a free agent signing, whether it's a bigger trade to go land a number one or a number two starting pitcher rather than, Flaherty kind of being a middle to back of the rotation kind of guy, if you're being honest. But again, in the meantime, it's tough to question what they've done to this point too much when you just look at where they stand right now. All these teams, let's be very clear, all of these teams in baseball have questions, have things that they'd like to shore up. I mean, Atlanta's the best team in baseball, okay,
Mhm.
and even they made some moves here recently. So, but beyond them, every team has some questions like the Orioles do right now. It might not be about having an ace. It might not be about the bullpen. It might be more on the offensive side of things. So again, these are all of this dialogue is ongoing, and Mike Elias, he's happy with where they are, but they also know that they want to continue to play well. They want to get better. They want to maintain what they've been able to do. And yeah, there are some fair questions about that. So that's why you go out and get Flaherty, you get Fujinami. The big question will be how much will those two individuals help, knowing that, Jack Flaherty, look, in 2019, which is 4 years ago, so I don't know how practical it is to expect anything close to that. He looked like he was going to be a star, top of the rotation,
Mhm.
all-star Cy Young type pitcher. He was fourth in Cy Young voting in the NL in 2019. Since then, he's had injuries and inconsistencies. Fujinami, he's technically a rookie coming over from Japan, got a great arm, but we know that he had some struggles, and you still see that he still walks a few too many guys. So, part of this is also, can the Orioles coaching and player development and their analytics and all the different technology they use, can they tweak these guys? Can they make the adjustments to make them better? And I think both of these individuals carry some upside. So, I think there's optimism. I don't think it's over the top optimism in the way that it would be if the Orioles had traded for Dylan Cease from the White Sox, who's a legitimate number one starting pitcher. But the White Sox, all indications are they wanted Jackson Holliday and probably a couple other pieces as well. And at this stage, the Orioles were not willing to do that. And the fact that the White Sox didn't trade him to anyone else shows you that no other teams were willing to meet the White Sox asking price. And if you see that, then I can respect, I can accept that the Orioles weren't able to get that done. And then it's on to the rest of this season and opportunities come the off season to continue to address your starting rotation.
Well, I'm guessing that whether you're Fujinami or Flaherty or any other pitcher, with this lineup, I mean, this team can flat out hit the ball. It's got to give the pitcher confidence. The what they've done with the left field wall, with the extension and the height of it, that's been very helpful to the
Yes.
Orioles. And you know what? They're tracking 100 wins for the year. You've got to like their chances. How can you not?
Yeah. And look, and anyone who knows baseball knows that October baseball is different than the regular season in the same way that playing in January in the NFL is different than playing in the regular season. So I'll hear all that. I'll hear the fact that I don't, I'll acknowledge, do I think the Orioles are completely primed and ready to win a World Series playing October baseball? It's tough to say that because they have so little experience, right? And yeah, the rotation is their weakness, when you're sizing up the roster. But at the same time, I can give you a lot of examples of other teams that you would have said that about, and then suddenly they're playing in a World Series. I said this to Nestor, the team that knocked the 2014 Orioles out of it in the ALCS, Kansas City. They made it to a World Series. Who was their ace? Off the top of your head, I'm guessing even a lot of baseball people would have to think about that for a second. So there are always exceptions to the rule. But to your point, this is a team that's tracking at this moment to be right around 100 wins, and we'll see if they do that
Sure.
for the next 2 months. Still have a lot of baseball to go, lots of potential pitfalls. So you got to stay healthy. Hopefully, you get some of your injured guys back. Whether you're talking about a Mullins, you have some pitchers who could return to the mix. Specifically John Means, even for the month of September, as he's coming back from Tommy John surgery last year. So, there's still some upside. There's still some untapped potential. At the same time, there are also guys that, will they continue what they've done to this point? Ryan O'Hearn's a great example of that. He's been such a great story. Will he continue to be one of their best hitters over the final 2 months in the way that he did the last couple months? So that's what makes this fun. It's a long, long season. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So, in the case of the Orioles, they've been really good to this point. I would have liked to have seen them add at least another bullpen piece.
Sure.
I'll stand firm on that at the very least. But that doesn't mean that I don't think they're going to be in the playoffs, or that doesn't mean that I don't think that they can't make at least a little bit of a run in the playoffs. Sometimes ignorance can be bliss when you're talking about
I
some of
agree.
these young guys who don't really.
Yep.
I thought it was interesting. I saw a couple reporters who were in Toronto in the clubhouse leading up to the deadline on Tuesday, and believe me, Dennis, I've been in some clubhouses leading up to the trade deadline, and it can be tight.
I'm
There
sure.
can be a lot of anxiety there, not knowing,
Sure.
especially if it's a case where, you're not quite as good. So you're wondering if there's, even some guys that you're going to sell, guys that you're going to trade
Well,
away that are
look,
in your clubhouse that
it,
aren't going to be there.
yeah, to your point, there was some speculation when they pulled Westberg at the end of the one game. Oh, is he traded?
Yeah.
Is that why he's off the field? And
Yeah.
of course, Brandon Hyde had at his press conference. Look, we did it for defensive. It was a defensive
Right.
alignment move. So even that minute of a situation that triggered, made social media go wild and with speculation. So I get that the clubhouse can be tight in those type of situations coming up against the trade deadline.
It can be, but all indications were the Orioles clubhouse on Tuesday was loose. Guys were
Right.
playing
Right.
Monopoly and just
Right.
hanging out.
Like
And
you said,
so,
ignorance is bliss. Sometimes, like you said, it can work for you versus against you. They're not. They don't know that they're not supposed to be there. They don't know that they're supposed to be ahead of the curve, this good, this quickly. Whether you completely turn around the season from the prior year, and all of a sudden you're competing for a championship, and hopefully they'll be, they'll win the whole damn thing before it sets in.
yeah, I mean, again, and I was Nestor posed this question to me that if I viewed the Orioles as, the favorites for the World Series. And look, I mean, I think it's difficult to do that given their lack of experience.
Sure.
But and I would say this about any team. If you're going to say team A versus the field, I'm going to take the field every time, especially in a sport like baseball where,
Absolutely.
it can be so unpredictable. I mean, the wild card round is a best of three, Dennis, a best of
Right.
three. I mean,
Right.
you're talking about a total coin flip even between one of the best teams and even if you randomly stuck a couple bad teams in the postseason, you would see some bad teams upset, pull off an upset in
Of
that case.
course.
So you have 3 game series, you have a 5 game series in the divisional round. So much of it's going to come to your matchup with whatever team you're going up against. How is the starting pitching set up, in terms of who's facing whom in any given day, and what's the weather like? There are a lot of variables at work here. So would I predict? Would I expect the Orioles to be in the World Series this fall? No. But at the same time, I fully expect them to get into the postseason at the very least, whether it's by winning the division or at least being one of the 3 wild cards. And from that point, you roll the dice. Buck Showalter used to always say that, and he's been around baseball way, way longer than I have. He's been around baseball longer than I've been alive, and he always just used to say, you get into the tournament and you roll the dice. It's a crapshoot, and there are certain things that help you in that. Like if you have a stud 1-2 punch starting pitcher, duo that some teams will have, but in the case of the Orioles, we'll see how it plays out. Again, that youth, if they can fortify the bullpen a little bit, and they have some different guys that could be in that mix as we get a little bit deeper down the stretch here. I mentioned John Means, maybe a DL Hall, maybe you get Michael Givens healthy. Tyler Wells, I think now with him having been optioned to
Yep.
the minors, when we see him come back, assuming you get him right over the next couple of weeks physically, I think there's a good chance you see him in the bullpen. And if you recall, a couple years ago, he pitched really well in a relief role as a Rule 5 rookie.
Hmm.
So, that they have some other options, and that doesn't mean it's going to all be fine either. But I think in the case of adding clarity and fortify their rotation a little bit, raise the floor a little bit of that rotation, and I think it does give you a little more flexibility to maybe move around some of these arms and kind of figure out what's going to be your optimal roster come the end of the regular season. And again, hopefully, very likely, extremely likely that you're going to be playing in the postseason.
I tell you, look, what's been really fun for me is, and I'll use this as an example. The other night against the Yankees, they score 7 runs in the first inning. But you know what? You stay tuned in, not just because it's early, but because you know what's going to happen with our pitching. Kramer was on the mound, and he got himself in some jams. He got himself out of some jams, but I never felt that 7 run lead was good enough. Whereas if you had an ace pitcher, you can feel a lot better going to innings 2, 3, and 4. And as the Yankees started chipping away, I was like, oh no, you know, they're going to catch us. And the Orioles, of course, in that game scored an extra 2 runs. They made it 9-3, which I believe was the final score. But my point is, even a 7 run lead to me in the first inning didn't feel safe. And that made it fun for me. Like, I'm
Yeah,
not saying as a negative. I thought it keeps you engaged and it keeps you tuned in.
well, that's a very positive spin of looking at it like that, Dennis. But I think some people would beg to differ that that's a positive. But you're not wrong, and it is a reflection of just where they stand with their pitching staff right now. I mean, and there's a perfect example. Dean Kramer. That was not a very good outing for him.
No,
When you're staked to that early touchdown lead, as he
touch,
put it, you'd like to see him at least get through 6 innings there. And don't be walking guys. Don't get especially with no one on base, be aggressive. If you give up a solo home run, so be it. Then you'll adjust from there. But don't be nibbling. Don't be in a position where you start to walk guys. So that was disappointing to see. But there's also a lesson there, and we saw this Tuesday night with a 13-3 win, which Kyle Bradish pitched really well, shaking off a couple early home runs, and I thought it kind of gave them a bulldog kind of
he did.
start, and that was good to see. I mean, it wasn't phenomenal, but it was he gave them 7 innings, which they haven't gotten a whole lot of starts like that, especially here of late. So But the point is, if you have an offense that can jump early, and this is a captain obvious statement, and I've said this to Nestor, but you have a few more blowouts like you did on Tuesday night. Those concerns about the back end of your bullpen aren't as
Right.
pronounced then, right? You have a night. I mean, look at what they were able to do with that Tuesday win. Batista, who had to get 5 outs the night before, he didn't have to pitch.
Right.
You were able to stay away from Cano, who's been struggling, and maybe he's overworked at this point. A Fujinami, who probably would have been their closer on Tuesday night because Batista certainly wasn't available. It might have been Fuji trying to close that game. He didn't even have to pitch at all, so now he's got a little more rest. So again, you know, it, it's like in football. If you have an offense that scored 50 points a game, then who
Yeah.
cares about your defense, right?
Yeah, they're like
But
the 81, the
if you can,
1981 Chargers, right? The Air
yeah,
Coryell, they score 45 but give up 48.
yeah. So and again, this is it's an obvious statement, but if you can pounce on some teams early, and look, I on Monday night, I love the Orioles' approach against Bassett. I mean, they were going the other way. That first inning, it looked like he was going to have a 1-2-3 inning. He had 2 strikes on Santander. He works a walk. So
Yeah.
he drives up the pitch count and they end up scoring a couple, they score some runs. So, you have more of those dialed in type of at bats and that dialed in type of an approach. And certainly, they scored a ton of runs on Tuesday night, but you get a little more of that. And their offense had scuffled since the All-Star break. So it was nice to see it awaken at the end of the Yankee series and in Toronto here. But, I think if you get a little more of that down the stretch, boy, it makes things that much easier for Brandon Hyde. I've said it over and over. I mean, people want to beat up the manager with his bullpen use. And look, I'll hear certain situations here or there where something, you'd say, okay, well, why did he use him in that spot? Why not go with this guy? One, there's usually more information at the manager's disposal as far as who's available, how guys are feeling, what their pitch count is on any given night, where they're trying to, you know, ease off of some guys who are maybe feeling it a little bit physically. But, two, you can't pitch Batista every single night. We were talking about this when Cano was going at his best. You can't pitch him every single night.
Right.
Somebody, whether it's someone in their current bullpen, whether it's someone that's currently on the IL, whether it's someone that's at AAA right now, and in the minor leagues, they're going to have to find some other guys that can get them some outs late in games. I mean, if they're going to sustain this, if they're going to continue this and make it into the playoffs and also have a chance to do something in October, they're going to have to find a couple more guys to do that. Fujinami looks like a candidate to be able to do that. Maybe Tyler Wells will be that guy. Maybe John Means is going to be in their bullpen once he's back at the major league level after some rehab assignment work. Maybe it's I mentioned Tyler Wells. Maybe Michael Givens finally gets healthy and does what the Orioles signed him to do back in the offseason. So the cupboard's not entirely bare, but they need some guys to step forward. And it can't just be Batista. It can't be Danny Coulomb all the time. It can't be Mike Baumann all the time because we've even seen those two guys have their occasional hiccups. So look, again, what I'm laying out here is not unique to the Orioles. There are other, including very much playoff caliber teams, other legitimate contenders talking about their bullpen, talking about their infield or their outfield or their starting rotation or some combination of all those things. Some teams have catching concerns. I mean, look at the Texas Rangers, their all-star catcher, Jonah Heim, not being healthy. I mean, imagine what would happen to the Orioles if, heaven forbid, Adley Rutschman suddenly had a physical issue. I mean, that would change the dynamic of this club very differently as he's become their leadoff hitter even. So, it's a long season. The success, as much as the Orioles have been able to sustain it, it can also be very fleeting if you get the wrong injury or two at the wrong time. But any team's dealing with that. So, we'll see how it plays out. I still very much like the position the Orioles have put themselves in. And we'll see how much Jack Flaherty and Fujinami and some of these other guys coming back from injuries, how much they can help them down the stretch.
Yeah, I'm with you. They've absolutely have walked down the Tampa Bay Rays. They've gotten ahead of them. They stayed ahead of them. And if the starting pitchers can could give the team 7 innings, look out. I mean, that makes things to all the great points you make. that much better. Now, Baltimore Ravens, I know that you've been attending training camp. You've got one today. What's the vibe like, and what are your observations thus far?
It's been about what I've expected, Dennis. I mean, I've said this to you many times, and we talk about this all the time. I mean, this is old hat for me. This is training camp number 15 that I've covered, and
Nice.
I've made the mistakes of buying into the hype of some young guys or a veteran player here or there in May and June and late July and early August. I will say the last couple of days with the pads having come on for the first time this summer, it reminds you how different the sport really is when you introduce the threat of contact. The tempo is different, the intensity level is different. I think they've handled it well. I think the passing game, and we talked about this last week, it remains a work in progress, but I think what's been heartening is I think the passing game has actually looked better since they put the pads on.
Good.
And, that sounds a little counterintuitive because when you're doing non-contact, inherently the offense should be at the advantage. When you're talking about offense versus defense. So I think I chalk it up to it's a new offense, and it's new for Lamar Jackson. It's new pieces. It's a new offensive coordinator. It's definitely structured differently. It's a different tempo getting up to the line of scrimmage, and Lamar having more on his plate pre-snap. So I didn't expect that to look great in late July. I don't expect that to look great now. I don't think it's necessarily even going to look great week one. Certainly, you want it to look good. You want it to look better than it does right now. But it's a process, and I get the sense that I think they feel they're on track. They know they have a lot of work to do, and I think that's evident. But I think they're optimistic about the work that they're putting in. And like I said, I've seen growth as it is, and early on, my early impressions, sticking with the passing game, I think Odell Beckham is moving like he's healthy. I think he's moving well. I think his route running is what you came to expect from him when he was at his very best with the New York Giants. My big question that will linger and remain, and it's a fair question, is how well will he run? And I don't mean on any given play. I mean, how well will he run as the days build up, as the weeks build up, as nagging issues here or there that any player will deal with,
Sure.
how as that builds up. I think that's where the question lies with him. On the flip side, Zay Flowers, again, early rookie wide receiver. I can recall, and I told this anecdote, I've shared this anecdote with Nestor. I can recall a very high ranking, prominent member of the Ravens organization telling me how they thought Brashad Perriman was already better than Torrey Smith, who had left to join the San Francisco 49ers that offseason. Well, maybe he would have been had he never hurt his knee, but I'm inclined to think that every team loves their own players. Every team thinks they're going to be the best version of themselves that coming season. But that aside, that acknowledged, Zay Flowers he's looked the part as someone who, at the very least, as a rookie, is going to be heavily involved in what they do. And I do know there are sentiments within that building, with whether you're talking about team officials or even players who, they think sooner than later he's going to be their best wide receiver. So we'll see how that plays out. Again, I gave you the Brashad Perriman example of how quickly perceptions and reality can change. So and certainly you want anyone to stay healthy, but Zay Flowers, they did one-on-one drills for the first time on Tuesday. Won every rep. He went up against Rock Yassin, went up against, I think it was Daryl Worley, and then went up against, I'm trying to think who the third was. It was, maybe Caillou Kelly, someone like that, a younger guy, or it may have been one of their undrafted guys. He won each rep, and he should. Receivers should win those one-on-ones, but it was good to see him look the part, and he also made, caught a couple touchdowns even in some 7-on-7 and full team stuff. So, Bateman's still, dealing with the foot, and they're slow playing him a little bit. So,
Well, they can. The other
that's
part
got
of
to
it, Luke,
be
they can slow play him because you do have Flowers, you
sure.
do have Odell, you do have Aguilar, who everybody said, look, he's
Yeah.
actually better than we thought he would be, at least at this point. So they do have some depth that they can ease in. I'd rather see Bateman get eased in the second half of the season versus rush him the first half, which, I mean, and they have a plethora of Rich, the tight end as well. Let's not forget about that.
Right. And look, with Bateman, and I don't even think it's going to necessarily be first half of the season versus second half. The indication I got at the beginning of training camp was don't look for him the first couple weeks of practice, and then after that, we think he'll be okay at that
Oh
point.
yeah,
I mean, it just some lingering discomfort in his foot.
right,
Remember he got the cortisone shot back in June,
right.
so I don't think there's serious concern, but I also don't want to dismiss it either because a foot is so
Oh,
critical to a football player. No pun intended. The foot in football is quite critical, and I'm not talking about the kicking game,
sure.
especially when you're talking about a skill player who depends on his speed and change of direction. So, there's going to be some lingering concern there until he shows otherwise. But to your point, they've got other guys.
Right.
Slow play them. They're not playing another game for well over a month. I mean that's where they are right
Yeah.
now. That
And
we
he
still
and he's very much a game changer. I remember the Miami game vividly, where the guy was explosive. He was very much the part of a wide receiver one. So to me, let's get the guy on the field when that foot is right. There's no need if it's iffy. Let the guy rest. I mean, what do you got to lose? It's not like you're desperate and you have to have him in there. You're not.
Yeah, I mean, there's just and even if even if they were in the position they were last year, right, where they didn't have nearly the depth at wide receiver, this time of year you still would err on the side of caution. I mean,
Of
you
course.
want to be smart about it. So, you know, uh, again, I'd be lying to you if I didn't have at least a little bit of concern with that. But that
Understood.
doesn't mean he's not going to be ready for week one. Doesn't mean he won't play at a high level. It's just where it is. Liz Frank injuries that's tough. Jimmy Smith, I remember years after having his, which was what, 2014, and this was probably talking to him, I don't know, 2019, maybe 2021, something like that. And I recall Jimmy Smith saying, Achilles, no problem. I had my ankle sprains, like those stunk, but once I was recovered. There was no lingering effect. The Liz Frank injury I had,
Different. Yeah.
every time it rains, every time it's
It's
cold,
different.
I felt it. And look, he played for at a high level for a number of years after that. When he was healthy, and that was a player who just dealt with so many physical concerns over the course of his career. But that's a perfect example of why you want to slow play this thing with Bateman.
Right. Right.
Make sure he's right. If he's dealing with a little, feeling it a little bit in the foot in July and early August, then keep him out of the lineup. He's out there, he's working out and doing things to stay ready. And again, we talked about this a lot with the Dobbins saga. If Bateman is out there by the second or third week of August, he should have plenty of time to get ready for the start of the season. If it's later than that, then yeah, then you start to have a little more legitimate concern. So
Sure.
I think with any talent like that, I mean, any player really, you this is the time of year where you still have plenty of time. Other than your quarterback, and this is where the Bengals are dealing with this right now. Although certainly they're not. It's not a new offense and it's an established quarterback. But other than the quarterback, anyone else missing practice time this time of year, it's not that big of a deal. It just isn't. And I know coaches will probably say otherwise because that's just how they're wired. But I think you always have to play the long game here, and I think that's certainly what they're trying to do with Bateman. I think that's what they're trying to do with Tyus Bowser. They're doing that with Patrick Ricard, who had hip surgery in the offseason. So they're trying to slow play these guys because they want them to be right when it really matters come September 10th and after that.
What about Devin Duvernay? I haven't heard any buzz about him this camp, Luke.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say it was probably what last Friday, the day that it was at its hottest. They had a lot of concentration drops among some of their other receivers. Zay Flowers wasn't on the field. Beckham didn't do a whole lot. I kind of wonder if he was,
Mm.
that was kind of a veteran saying,
Made a
it's hot. I'm
business
going to take it
decision.
easy today.
Made a business
That
decision, didn't he?
Yeah, Duvernay was the best wide receiver on the field that day for
Okay.
them. It's been relatively quiet for him. I'd be lying to you
Okay.
if I was overly impressed. I don't think he's had a bad camp either. It's still very early, but I think it's just tough. I mean, someone like Duvernay, I mean, look, he from the time Bateman went down last year, he and Demarcus Robinson were their starting wide receivers.
They were. And that's
So
why I
it
brought him
was,
up because,
yeah,
I go back to when, he was with Texas and he was tearing up our Terps. Uh, I want to see that guy back on the field. Never mind him returning
yeah.
punts and kickoffs.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, and I don't say that to be flippant about the player he was at the college level. I start to think at this point, this is probably who he is, which is really good return man.
Yep.
Probably, probably best suited to, certainly best suited to be at least a number three wide receiver, if not a number four, if you're talking about an explosive passing game. And you look at the depth chart right now. I mean, you have Zay Flowers, you have Odell Beckham Jr., you have Rashad Bateman as your top three. You have Nelson Aguilar, who four or five with Duvernay there. So,
Laquan Treadwell,
this is
who's also a very
probably
good special team player, right? Let's not forget about that. A dark horse.
well. What's funny is, and that's not even he hasn't had a bad camp necessarily, but he's a long shot to make the roster. I mean,
Dark horse, but
yeah,
we like our special team players too in
we
Baltimore.
do. But I think that probably the stronger consideration there is not giving up on Tylan Wallace yet. Because
Understood.
he has 2 years of team control. I mean, if I'm being perfectly blunt, James, and of course, injuries change the equation right away. We know that. So if we're acknowledging that, if I'm being blunt, Treadwell's a long shot. James Prochet is probably a long shot to make
Yeah,
this
at
team.
this point, yes.
Tylan Wallace is on the bubble. They have some other interesting young rookie wide receivers, undrafted rookie wide receivers in camp. Some guys that have even made some plays, but they're all best case. They're looking at the practice squad. So, that's kind of where they are right now. And by the way, that's a good thing because that means that the top of their depth chart looks way better than it has in a long time. So, yeah, we'll see how it plays out. And again, I mean, it's not to say that they have the best wide receiver group in the NFL either. And Bateman has an injury history. Odell Beckham certainly has an injury history. And, Zay Flowers is of slighter stature, even though he's much, he's tougher than his size. He definitely plays tougher than his size would indicate. So, you're going to need some depth. There's no question about that, but it's definitely a different state of affairs. Just using Devin Duvernay as a very simple example, who at one point last season looked like their default number one wide receiver. And now you're looking at him battling it out with Aguilar to be the number four guy, the guy that might run some gadget plays here and there, but certainly not someone that right now is looking like he's going to be any kind of an every down player for this offense.
Luke, as always, I appreciate your time. Please tell our listeners what you got going on in social media, your presence with WNST, your blog. I know we got SummerSlam this weekend, right? August the 5th. I know you're looking forward to that as well.
Absolutely. I encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter at WNST or at Baltimore Luke, my personal account. Also can find me on Threads if you're into that or any other social media. Check out Baltimore Luke. Check out my blog at baltimorepositive.com, sponsored by Coons Ford of Baltimore. My latest 12 Ravens thoughts on training camp. I've been doing that just about every day with a brief respite here with being a little busier on the baseball side with the trade deadline, but you can check that out. Check out my thoughts on the Jack Flaherty trade for the Orioles. All of that at baltimorepositive.com. You want to be on the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Ford of Baltimore. If you are, you got the notification that the Orioles had acquired Jack Flaherty, or a couple weeks ago when they acquired Fujinami. Any significant Ravens signings, any significant Ravens injury news? Fortunately, there hasn't been too much of that. Geno Stone dealing with a little bit of an ankle issue, and David Ajabo left the field briefly the other day, but he came back, so nothing to be concerned about. But any significant local sports news sent directly to your mobile device via the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Ford of Baltimore. And of course, anything throughout the week on AM 1570 with Nestor. Any Orioles players and manager sound from the ballpark as they return home this weekend to take on the New York Mets. Any Ravens players and coaches interviews from Owings Mills. Check out all of that at baltimorepositive.com.
All right, Luke, always fun. Wish we had more time, but we're up against the clock, unfortunately. Love talking Orioles and Ravens with you, and it's going to be a great weekend for sports. SummerSlam, we got Orioles, we got Ravens, and more content to come for sure 1 week from today.
Sounds great, Dennis. There'll be plenty to talk about. Be well.
You too. There he goes, Luke Jones here, 1570 AM. WNST, keep it locked in right here. We'll take a quick break and come back right after this.